Viewers, the U.S. Iran conflict has entered a more dangerous phase. Missiles have given way to retaliation, and retaliation is driving further escalation. Donald Trump says Washington will keep the Strait of Hormuz and it should be paid for. But Tehran has drawn a firm line, vowing it will never allow U.S. control in the managing of Hormuz. As diplomacy fades and the rhetoric sharpens, the big question is, if this conflict widens further, will NATO stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States, as it has been in the past? Let's tell you Donald Trump's latest remark against Iran. The U.S. president says Washington will keep the Strait of Hormuz, probably run it and become its guardian, and it should be getting paid for protecting it. The remarks have sharpened tensions with Tehran and Iran in issuing a strong protest. Tehran has flatly rejected Trump's claim that U.S. can guard or manage the strait, calling Washington and its allies the driving force behind growing instability. Iran has made its position unmistakably clear. Hormuz is not up for negotiation. With both sides digging in, the war of words is fast turning into a high-stakes geopolitical standoff. Let's also tell you more about the war of words between Washington and Tehran. The U.S.'s Central Command has said that they've launched fresh wave of strikes hitting dozens of targets across Iran and key military infrastructure. Tehran, in turn, claims that it has retaliated, targeting a U.S. military base in Kuwait and an air base in Jordan. What are the areas that Iran claims it has attacked? Let's tell you via the map. Iran has struck military sites in Oman. They've also attacked Jordan. If you can quickly bring up those particular sites as well. Yes, Jordan, the Prince Hassan Air Base. Bahrain has seen Sheikh Isa Air Base. There's also, of course, Kuwait, where we are seeing Ali Al Salam as well as Ahmad Al Jabbar air bases, which have been hit. So these are some of the areas that have been hit as far as the Middle East is concerned in the neighborhood of Iran. But what's the extent of damage caused by Iran? In Jordan, we've seen fuel tanks and ammunition depots that have been hit. In Bahrain, the U.S. Army installations and infrastructure have been hit. In Kuwait, there are U.S. surface-to-surface missile bases that have been hit. And in Kuwait, fuel depots and air defense infrastructure has been hit. In Oman, the FPS long-range aerial radar, and also in Oman, vessel detection radars that have been targeted. Meanwhile, U.S. says that it has carried out one of its most extensive operations yet inside Iran. According to CENTCOM, strikes targeted Khuzestan, Manshar, as well as Bandar Abbas, along with air defense systems, coastal radar sites, and Iran's missile and drone capabilities. Now, Washington says the operation was aimed at degrading Iran's military network as the conflict continues to escalate. Viewers, the geopolitical turmoil is now hitting global energy markets. Brent crude has surged from just under $72 a barrel on July 6th to over $78 on July 13th, with sharp swings in between. This spike reflects growing fears of supply disruptions as tensions around the Strait of Hormuz intensify. If the conflict escalates further, oil prices could see even greater volatility than we've already seen over the past week or so. Well, Trump and NATO have also been at loggerheads over the U.S.-Iran conflict. U.S. President has recently said that he's not happy with the military assistance and has warned that America could pull its troops out of Europe. Trump has also questioned why the U.S. should spend billions defending allies who, according to him, aren't standing with Washington. Joining us now is Dr. Stefanie Babst, who's been a former Deputy Assistant Secretary at NATO. Thank you so much for joining us and speaking to us here at Times. Now, first up, let me begin by asking you, how do you assess what's happening in West Asia at the moment? The war has resumed and doesn't seem like the hostilities are going to die down anytime soon.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't look like it. Definitely not. The war that Russia has launched on Ukraine has been by far a war which goes beyond territorial gains or access to natural resources. It is an existential war for President Putin because he denies Ukraine the right as a state, and he wants to subjugate Ukraine. So he's determined to continue waging war and launching a military campaign against Ukrainian civilians. So there is only one way around. We need to help Ukraine to win the war against Russia, because a permanent occupation of Russian forces in Ukraine will further and dramatically destabilize the European continent and, of course, Ukraine as such. And we certainly don't want to see a second Iron Curtain in the midst of Europe falling down that would separate Ukrainians from the rest of Europeans.
Right. But the bigger question, that is of immediate interest to many is what will happen as far as West Asia is concerned. Now, NATO has been on record to say that you've allowed over 5,000 sorties from Europe in the past. How are we looking at things going from here on as far as West Asia is concerned?
West Asia?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, West Asia is certainly of strategic importance for a number of allies, not only because of economic ties and because of India's absolutely critical role that it plays in the Indo-Pacific region. India has very advanced maritime capabilities, and thus is, I think, a very critical source of stability and collaboration around this part of the world. We would look definitely at India and other players in the region to continue collaborating in order to keep the situation as it is, which is rather a peaceful situation, and to contain all those assertive powers who would like to change the status quo in the region. Let me also add that the number of European allies who are concerned about the ongoing escalation in the Strait of Hormuz in the framework of the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran is of big concern. However, most European countries have made clear that they would only be willing to step in and start considering a maritime security operation in that part of the Gulf region if hostilities cease. And this is clearly not the case. So I'm afraid to say the Trump administration has really put itself in a difficult position, because they are dealing with a country, or rather with a regime in Tehran, which is extremely resilient and is clearly not willing to put aside military hostility at this period of time. It will continue to bargain, and our job is, including, I think, those here in Europe, to put diplomatic pressure on the parties concerned.
Right. And how would you characterize President Trump's approach towards NATO itself?
Well, Europeans and Canadians have been through a lot of roller coasting with President Trump in the past 12 or so months. I mean, you recall the punitive tariffs that he put on European companies. You recall the red carpet treatment he organized for President Putin in Alaska. He threatened an ally such as Denmark over Greenland. He is very hostile to the European integration project. And all this has taken European governments a bit of a time to realize, at least that's my humble view, that President Trump is no longer a reliable ally. He is no longer the one who would come to our defense, especially not if he continues to threaten allies in his own camp and call them paper tigers. So the logical consequence of that for European governments and Canadians is to be prepared to secure the European continent with their own capabilities and forces. And this is what they have just decided at the NATO summit that took place last week in Ankara. Not only in terms of stepping up their defense budgets, but also launching a couple of critical defense industrial projects aimed at generating the capabilities we need, because it's clear that the US will continue to withdraw personnel and capabilities from Europe in the months and the time to come.
Right.
All this is if I just add one sentence, I mean, all this is a pretty bitter pill, because on our side of the pond, we certainly wanted to keep the transatlantic relationship alive, but President Trump is clearly a very erratic and disruptive player, and you can't rely on him.
Right. I just want to add to that because, he has said that he's not happy with the NATO alliance itself. He's complained in the past about Britain not helping the U.S. during the Iran war. He's even spoken of wanting to sever trade ties with Spain. Now, what does this really mean for the future of NATO and the participation of NATO, possibly if we're talking about, any future cooperation in West Asia as well?
Well, as I said at the NATO summit last week, I think Europeans and Canadians demonstrated quite vividly that they are prepared to really step up to the plate and start with what I would call the Europeanization of NATO, both politically and militarily. The Trump administration will not leave NATO officially, but it could further damage NATO's credibility and ability to deter and defend against the Russian threat or other threats. If President Trump continues to display this disruptive behavior. So it is really important to understand that trust has been lost, and an alliance operating with no trust is a difficult enterprise. So we want to, at least that's my proposal, I think should reinvigorate NATO, yes, and be prepared to secure our own continent, deter and contain Russia to the extent possible, because Russia, I think, will continue to remain a toxic player, a very threatening player for European countries in the years to come, unless the regime changes. And as far as Asia is concerned, I have strongly advocated for a long time already for Europeans to step up cooperation, for instance, with a country like India. India and Europe share a lot of converging interests, not only in the economic field or in the field of technology, but also in defending the rules-based order. And I think this should be our starting point, because I don't think that a country like India would like to end up living in a jungle where, no rules apply any longer and assertive powers play a, might makes right game. And this should be also a conversation we should be having with each other.
Absolutely. And in fact, I just want to take you up on the point that you mentioned as far as Russia is concerned. In the context of that, how dependent is Europe today on the American security umbrella, particularly when the Russia-Ukraine war is underway?
Well, Europeans are in NATO, I think, still dependent when it comes to a couple of critical capabilities. This includes, for example, strategic air support. This includes air defense systems. This includes command and control arrangements. And these dependencies have long been known. They're absolutely not new. So the Europeans have basically pulled together a list and started to see how they can actually develop these capabilities by their own means. And again, referring to the NATO summit in Ankara last year for the third time, it was also decided there that Europeans would start developing their own air defense system, because it's absolutely critical that we have our own. And if we can do this with joint forces, including with the premier and stellar experience that the Ukrainians bring on board, I think we would have a good starting point. But this will not happen overnight. So we will need a little bit time, and we would need to have clarity and predictability from the US side as far as the envisions reduction of their capabilities is concerned. To my understanding, we are still waiting for a clear timetable. And this, I think, causes a problem, because if you don't know really when the US will reduce its capabilities and personnel in Europe, it's difficult.
Right. But the other way of looking at it is, how much does the United States really need Europe, going forward, and NATO going forward?
Well, I mean, the United States, at least in the previous administrations, have always historically considered themselves as a European power, not in order to give us, some generous help, but because it serves their strategic interests. The basis and the capabilities that they are having here in Europe serves U.S. power projection worldwide. It serves also operational planning and execution, as we have seen, especially with the campaign against Iran. So these logistical hubs, the planning hubs, the military command centers, I would assume that the United States will keep them in Europe, but they will keep them for their own purpose.
Right.
But if you look at the broader picture includes trade, it includes technological collaboration, it includes economic cooperation, and many other issues. I wouldn't say we are dependent on each other, but obviously we would like to continue cultivating these ties.
Right. And is there scope for NATO to play a more proactive role in this ongoing West Asia conflict? Because that is what Trump appears to indicate when he says that he hasn't received much help.
Well, Mr. Trump keeps on complaining if he receives help, and he also keeps on complaining if he doesn't receive any help. Bottom line is that he hasn't even consulted for 5 minutes with the allies before he waged the war. He hasn't even consulted with us in order to become clear what is his strategic endgame in this. So, but leaving that aside, European countries, at least those who possess adequate military capabilities, have made clear that they would come in and support the Trump administration by launching a maritime operation in the Strait of Hormuz. But only if the ceasefire actually holds, only if there is really a peace agreement, only if there are really a preparedness by all sides to cease hostilities. And this is not the case. But the countries, with the UK and the lead, France, my own country, Germany, and others, I think we have made pretty clear to President Trump that we are no bystanders, but that we were also critical of the very idea, I mean, to try to go for a regime change in Tehran without actually having a proper military strategy in place. I mean, that was pretty ridiculous.
Right. Thank you so much, Stefanie Babst, for taking the time out, ma'am, and speaking to us here at Times Now.
You're most welcome. Good evening.